Good afternoon, everybody. I'm pleased people stayed. I'm never sure whether it's a curse or a blessing when you're the last speaker. Clearly today it's a blessing, so thank you for staying. I want to start the talk by just posing a number of questions that I think are quite relevant for us. We've had No Secrets in England established in 2000. We've had 16 years of adult protection and adult safeguarding in various forms. After all these years, why are we still seeing horrendous abuse of older people happening almost routinely in England and Wales? Why has there been no assessment of the effectiveness of adult protection? We've invested hugely in this country in the development of systems. The Care Act established it on a statutory basis, but we've never actually looked at how effective are we in outcomes terms, in actually making a difference. And probably a more fundamental question for me is why have we never funded strategies for education of the public about what elder abuse is, what abuse of adults is, and why are we not effectively investing in prevention? I remember Paul Burstow, who briefly was the Minister for Social Care, speaking at one of my advocacy conferences quite a number of years ago and talking about how we're so busy pulling people out of the river, we're not going down the bank and seeing who's pushing them in. Wouldn't it be better to prevent abuse than do what we're doing, which is intervene after the event, which is all we seem to be doing these days? It's all we've got time for. It's all we've got funding for, is to intervene after the end. Why is this? My experience with the charity since 2002, I have to say, is maybe very cynical of governments. And it really doesn't matter to me which political persuasion they are. I am cynical every time I sit down and talk to them about vulnerability of adults and about abuse of old people. Because what I quickly realise is there is reality, which most of us live in, and then there's theory. There is the theory that tries to avoid dealing with the reality. And if ever there was a good example of that, it was our debate a couple of years ago in terms of powers of access, where ideology completely overwhelmed reality. It did not matter what evidence we provided to government. The ideology said you don't intervene in family affairs when you're talking about adults, so nothing else mattered. Ideology takes the place, and governments, parties come into government based on ideology. They already have their beliefs. I remember one of the academics a number of years ago saying to me, there's an issue about, is policy developed on evidence, or do you go and establish the policy and then go look for the evidence to fit the policy? I have to say my experience of the development of adult protection over the last 10 years is we have established the policy and then we've selectively gone to look for the evidence to make it justifiable of what we've done. If we actually looked openly at what's taken place in our communities, in our families, with older people, and I have to say other adults in vulnerable situations, we would have a different world here when we were talking about adult protection than what we've actually got. It's a worrying situation because what this effectively does is constrains the effects that we can have on what are considered controversial issues. And intervening in family life is acceptable to an extent if we talk about domestic abuse, but it is not acceptable if we use any other description of abuse. Abuse of old people, if we don't put it in a domestic abuse context, you do not intervene. That is one step you don't go too far because you're conflicting with the ideology, the false belief that all families are nice. And I think Paul's descriptions, I love following him. I love following you because you hit it the way I like to hear it. The reality of too much family is they are the abusers. It is not what the media tell us, and part of that is my fault, that it all happens in care homes. No, it doesn't. It happens behind the family front door. And when that family person stands up and says, you're not coming in here, we have no powers to get in. The government, the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services told us the police, the PACE, will give us access, knowing, as they said it, no it didn't. We're in the same ball game as San Diego. They shut that door, we cannot get in, there is no way in. But I want to take you on a little line here, because the best example of ideology and how we go is when we start looking at the words that we use. And words are important. They construct how we think about things. They construct the concepts of adult protection. Words have an impact. They can triage our responses. They can lead us down different roads depending on which words that we actually use, and they can change the way we perceive events. They can make us look at things in a different approach. Our protective systems are distinct in England from our criminal justice ones. They don't even always share the same perceptions. If you go and look at the social policy understanding of capacity that we're all working on through the Mental Capacity Act, and go and look at the case studies in the High Court of their definitions of capacity, of inherent jurisdiction to intervene, and what capacity actually means, it's different. And the courts will actually challenge our arguments about choice and control being paramount, and will actually say, no, it's not. At the one and same time as we're all being told, yes, it comes first. There are two parallel streams of adult protection in England. There's the social policy route that started with No Secrets and is now developed through the Care Act. And then there's what's taken place in the High Court. And they do not always speak with the same voice, and they don't always share the same perceptions. Inspection and regulation of care homes are focused around standards, folks, and this is not a criticism, let me say, of CQC. I've got a lot of respect for what CQC has done. But they're based on standards that become so vague that if you are a relative or a family member, you can't use them. They are meaningless. I cannot, in all honesty, say to a relative who rings my helpline, here's the ratio of staffing for a care home in terms of the number of vulnerable people. If I was talking to you about a nursery, I could. I could say number of children versus number of nursery nurses, but I cannot say that about a care home because I now have a standard that says sufficient. What does sufficient mean? How do I explain to a family member what sufficient means when their resident, their relative, has been so badly hurt by the lack of staffing in a care home? Where do we make that argument? The standards have become too vague. And I have to say, many acts that would be considered crimes by public perception never reach courts. They get diverted down a social policy route, and that social policy route, through No Secrets and the Care Act, is about stopping the abuse. It is not about prosecuting the perpetrator. That is very much down the list of what we do. And I just want you to look as a comparison between those two routes. If I can get this right now. Social policy definition. Back in 2001, we went down the road of describing things as abuse. I wish I could turn time back. Because I tell you, for now, with all we know of this last decade, I would not be using words like financial abuse or psychological abuse. I would be going to the other side of that equation, which is what the law says they are. And if you read the words, the descriptions that the law say, doesn't it convey an entirely different perspective than the actual policy words? Physical abuse is assault. It's hurting people, it's pain, it's suffering, and that's what the law says. Sexual abuse. Let's call it rape. Let's call it sexual assault, and doesn't it change what it means? How could I have had a prevalence study, which we helped create, £600,000 to create, when it came to talking about sexual abuse of older people, said, well, most of it is actually at the lower end of sexual abuse, and it's questionable whether we'd want to call it abuse. It was assault. It was sexual intimidation and harassment. But academics, based on this, felt able to describe it as something else. Words triage. They have an effect. And they describe what's being done in a way that doesn't actually help us. When you look at what we're talking about, it is different how the law describes it than we actually say it. And by lessening our understanding of the realities of what's taking place, it makes it much easier to divert it away from the victim's right to justice and away from the victim's right to the law. Am I making sense to you? If we describe it in a subtle way that doesn't convey what's actually happening, it makes it easier for us not to deal with it. I time and time again hear my staff on the helpline saying to people, okay, that's your grandmother, she's 86. What would you do if she's 26? And in talking about sexual assault, I heard them talk to one case where they hadn't even involved the police because she was 86. They were so busy trying to make sure there was no further abuse and wrap her in cotton wool, it never crossed their minds it was a crime. That's where we go to when we go too far down social policing of abuse. Abuse hurts. Abuse is a crime. Whether or not it's prosecuted is an entirely different ballgame. It is a crime, and we need to see it as such. Now, just to put some of this in context for you, did you know the RSPCA website reckons there's 141,000 animals abused each year? And the majority of those are prosecuted, admittedly under private prosecutions by the RSPCA, but nevertheless they're prosecuted. I was quite surprised when I looked at the NSPCC website, because for some reason, I've held in my head for a long time, there's about 1 million children abused. I don't know why I got that, but they actually estimate about 400,000 children are abused. There are thousands of people prosecuted for child abuse in our country. It's a horrible thing, I know, and it's not something I'm comfortable with. Prevalence study tells us there's somewhere between 500,000 and 800,000 older people abused each year. Very few prosecutions. Now, I know that the CPS, and again, I got some time from, not a great deal, but some time from, I know they say that of the number of cases that come to them, about 80% are successful prosecutions. If you put their prosecution rate in the context of the prevalence, less than 1% of abuse of old people ever gets to be convicted. Less than 1%. What does that tell us? I'll put that in context for you for hate crime. It varies between 3% and 9% against prevalence. Less than 1%. That says something about how we're perceiving it, what we're thinking about it. Let me give you some realities to think about, because this is quite important for me. You know, year on year, in terms of adult protection referrals, older people, as a percentage of the total who's getting referred to adult protection, has increased by 1% every year. 64% this year, 63% the year before, 62% the year before that. We went and said to the government and the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, don't you think we should do something about this? Because either we're not getting the message through about prevention or something's gone significantly wrong here. And their answer was, no. If that was children, I guaranteed you we'd be doing something about it. I guaranteed you there'd be a reaction to it. This is ageism that I'm talking about. This is an attitude towards age and vulnerability that is unique to how we're thinking about our adults, our vulnerable adults, our older adults, people in situations that can't protect themselves. Our best estimate, based on the prevalence study, is no more than 1 in every 10 instances of abuse ever reach adult protection of elder abuse. No more than 1 in 10, and yet it's going up a percentage rate each year. If all the people, older people who were being abused, got to the attention of adult protection tomorrow, it would fall over in the morning. It couldn't handle the volume. Now you think about that right now, out in each one of our boroughs, how many people are in family situations, our next door neighbours, behind closed family doors, being abused, and nothing is being done to access them, to educate people, to make it an unacceptable thing to be actually happening. The population of older people is expected to rise to about 19 million in 30 years. 19 million in 30 years. 1.6 million victims if we don't stop it now. That's a phenomenal figure to think about, isn't it? Can you imagine? You can't even, that's greater than some of our cities. That's how big it is. How does that translate into reality on the ground for us? I want to take you through some of the cases that we've been dealing with and talk what the criminal justice system has done. And the first one I want to share you with is Frida Jobson. Frida was 84 years of age, ill-treated by 3 carers. Now, there's an awful lot of argument out there at the moment that says, let's get hidden cameras in all over the place. Let's get cameras into all care homes and that'll change things. They were caught on camera. They were caught on camera mimicking her, taunting her, swearing at her. They took the bandage off her elbow with a pressure ulcer and wrapped it around her head, laughing at her. The Capacity Act was ignored. There was no prosecution under the Capacity Act. The crime was ignored. A police caution was given for that. Now, let me be clear on this. I'm not blaming the police for this, because the Adult Safeguarding Board in that area supported that decision. And the chair of that Adult Safeguarding Board, when they were challenged by us as why haven't you prosecuted, argued with us that it was the right decision of a caution, because after all, they wouldn't be able to work in social care again. So haven't they been penalised enough? Now, let me just make that even worse, because it gives you the context of my reality and the reality that some people are living in. The chair of that board is the ADAS lead on adult safeguarding. And if he's thinking that, what hope in hell do we have in terms of how he's conveying that to civil servants? The ADAS lead in adult safeguard couldn't see there should have been a prosecution. It took us 12 months to get the police to decide, yes, they were going to reverse that and actually put it to CPS. Because, of course, as you all know, unless the police make the referral to CPS, CPS can't get involved. It then took 3 interventions by us to actually get to the point where the CPS said, yes, we are now going to prosecute, and then the case went to court. Now, I have to say, at that point, we were actually thinking that's brilliant. We've overturned this, we've got it at court, they're going to see all this, they see the pictures, terrific, no problem. What do they get? What do they get? Community service. Despite camera footage, despite an admission of guilt, despite seeing those pictures, and let's be honest, I'll pull your heartstrings, didn't she look a very frail, vulnerable old woman? And to do that, community service. Now that starts to make us think what's going wrong here. And that's why we did freedom of information requests to every place we could think of. We sent them to the police and said, tell us the number of prosecutions that you're putting forward for CPS. The majority of the police forces, the overwhelming majority of police forces said, it'd be too costly to tell you that. We don't keep records about prosecutions of older people. One of them said to us, well, we've had 76 investigations of elder abuse. We gave a police caution to every single one of them. Every single one of them. One of them told us in 12 months they didn't have a single instance of elder abuse at all. Stretches credibility, doesn't it? Now, I'm not blaming the police, because what I'm actually going to start showing you here is there is a whole system here of not looking and not recording and not monitoring. We went to the court service and said, tell us. And their answer was, we can't tell you. We don't know. We're not required to keep the information about older people. We went to the Ministry of Justice and said, tell us. And they said, we can't tell you because we're not required to keep that information. And despite the fact that the CPS have got a brilliant policy on prosecuting crimes against older people, and I would say that because we helped them develop it, they don't monitor it. They don't keep records on it. They don't know. And the bottom line of our entire system is if you don't monitor it, you don't have to report it, there's no accountability for it. It doesn't exist. If you don't have the evidence, it actually doesn't exist. And that's what we came away with, that despite the fact that on paper people say these things, the reality is no one's bothered, no one's looking. And I take no away from those police forces that have uniquely gone ahead, such as we heard today, and actually done something about it. But when we're talking of the overwhelming picture, they are a lifeboat in a sea of chaos. They're a lifeboat in a situation in which nobody wants to know. It's too big a problem. All I hear is there's too many old people. We can't cope with the volume of it. We can't fund it. We can't monitor it. We can't get a grip on it. So we won't do anything about it. We'll just leave it alone and hope it goes away. We can't have that. Let me show you this and think about this, and I'll talk about the justifications of this later. Look at this figure in terms of the number of substantiated cases of elder abuse in the last 12 months as opposed to the number of cases that actually got prosecuted. Now, there are all sorts of arguments you can make about do people want prosecutions, what's the complexities of family situations. I accept all that. But look at the disparity and tell me that holds up and say to me that if that was domestic abuse, that would be an acceptable graph. Doesn't that tell us there's something going wrong with how we're looking at this and how we're thinking about this? This translates, folks, into straightforward and simple injustice of older people. This is saying when you reach a certain age, your rights to your civil liberties, your rights to access justice are taken away from you. If you're 26, we said to that young woman, if you're 26, your grandmother's 26, she will get access to the law, she will get her day in court, she will get justice. But if she's 86, forget it. How does age get into this? Surely a crime is a crime is a crime. You prosecute crimes unless there's a very, very, very good reason why you shouldn't do it. And I'm with him on that. I think they're few and far between. Let me give you an example of this. Beryl and Mervyn Bevan. This got me. They were married for 63 years. This swine got involved with them and managed to get the PIN number and the card from them and cleared them out of every penny that they had, every single penny. They ended up in 2 separate care homes because of the impact that had. And let me say to you, there is strong medical evidence that an older person's ability to fight off major issues, it has an effect on them. They die. The immune system is affected through age. They die. If somebody steals from you, you won't like it, but you'll live. If someone steals from an old person, there's a high potential they're going to die. These 2 ended up in care homes. Mervyn died without ever seeing his wife again. I can't get over that. 63 years they've been together, and that swine gets involved. They're separated, and she never sees him again, and he never sees her again. And that goes to court. And what did they give? What did they give? Suspended sentence and community service. Please, God, will somebody say to me that's acceptable? Because I can't cope with that. I cannot cope with that. What do you need to do to get a significant sentence in our courts if you're old? What do you need to do to an old person to actually mean you get something that is going to penalise and hurt you? Look at this one. There was a relationship there. Look how long they'd been together. There was a relationship there. Died beforehand. Now, wouldn't you think that would have some bearing? Wouldn't you think? Suspended sentence and community service. Why? How can that happen? I have to start asking these questions. Now, that is not to say, I'm going to stand here and say to you, in every single case, it's been like this. There have been some prison sentences. But these are too glaring, and the frequency of these are too much for us not to say something is going wrong. Look at this one. Slapped, assaulted, pinched, twisted. Assaulted on more than one occasion. Cut and dried. Proved. Very, very clear. The abuse that took place. Community service. How is this a deterrent? How is this saying to this one, or in fact others, if you hurt old people, there's going to be a consequence for you? How does that work? Another one. Slapped, arm twisted, sprayed with water. Result, first of all, a prison sentence, and then overturned on appeal and given community service. How? I sit sometimes and I look at these cases and I just try to work out what's going on in people's minds. And one of the things I've concluded from listening on more than one occasion to Paul is we need more juries involved. Because magistrates and judges are not in the real world when it comes to what we're going on. The family here said they felt completely left down by the justice system. They were devastated that they'd got a result that made them feel that what had taken place to their loved one, at least there was some and then it was taken away from them. Taken away on appeal. You have to ask, don't you, why is that? The next one I show you, I have to be honest, doesn't meet my criteria of elder abuse. It doesn't. But it's an old man who was still carrying on working at 71 as a cabbie, and he had the gross misfortune of picking up this guy who was stinking rich. And you know, this guy drunk nearly 15 bottles of champagne that day at his party with his mates. And when he got in this cab, the cab driver couldn't in the sat-nav find his new address because it wasn't in the sat-nav yet. So while the guy was still strapped with the seatbelt in, he beat the crap out of him. He wasn't able to eat for months. He never worked again. Completely destroyed his life. Absolutely devastated him. What happens? Suspended sentence and community service. How? I keep coming back. How does it happen? How can we say this is justice? And if you want a really good example of the differences in thinking in domestic abuse and adult abuse, I'll give you Mary Russell. Mary was 81 years of age. A typical, if there is such a thing, domestic abuse situation. She was getting beaten regularly, there were call-outs to the police, she was ended up in 999 and admitted into A&E on a very regular basis. And if you looked at it and you put it into a pattern like go to Women's Aid and talk to them, they would say that was classic domestic abuse. Nobody thought domestic abuse. They saw two 80-year-olds. He killed her. He killed her. Why are we not learning the lessons? How does the age get in the way? And I think as a point I make, and I know my colleague here makes, these are our mums, these are our dads, these are our sisters, our brothers. We're lucky we're never born with a learning disability. If we're lucky, we never develop a mental health problem. If we're lucky, we never have an accident and end up being disabled in some way. But if we're lucky, we'll all grow old. Why on earth are we allowing this to happen in age? Because we're just letting it happen to us. It'll be us one day. And we won't protect ourselves because it doesn't matter how compos mentis you are. If somebody can keep you physically constrained someplace, they can abuse you. If we don't stop it, it's us. And wouldn't you think, even if you didn't feel the moral arguments I'd make, I could sell it to you as an insurance policy? Yeah? We're looking at a case at the moment, and I was thinking this very much while I was listening to the prosecution of that case in the care home. We're looking at a case right now, it's in court, where this old woman died of hypothermia in a care home. Hypothermia in a care home. Her family had been expressing concern about how cold it was. They had no regulators for the radiators, which weren't working. They had no thermometers. The staff were asked to go into a room and decide for themselves, does it feel cold? When that woman was taken to hospital on the point of death, she was 10 degrees below the hypothermic point. 10 degrees below hypothermic point in a care home in our country. How can that be? That's what I mean when I say to you, after 16 years, folks, how can this still be going on? But here's my real plug for you. Do you know what they're getting charged under? Health and Safety at Work Act. Do you know why? There's no law they can be charged under. They can't prove willful neglect. I don't know why, but they can't. There is no law no individual is being held accountable. It will be the company that's done under the Health and Safety at Work Act. That tells me all I need to know about what we're thinking in terms of protecting people that rely on all of us for a future of dignity and safety and support, because we're not giving it. The Older People's Commissioner in Wales, brilliant woman, Sarah Akira. If you ever want to do a Google, you want somebody who's a champion of older people, she's it. This is what she said after the Operation Jasmine, and I'm sure Margaret will have talked to you about that this morning. This is what she said, and I can sum it up. How bad does it have to get? And I think that's a fair question to ask. How bad before we do something about this? Before we stop playing the games, before we stop focusing on this policy and that procedure and whether or not the word fits, and we actually deal with the reality. And I really don't care much about words anymore. There are too many people hurting and bleeding and dying for us to play these politics any longer. And I can say to you now, I have sat in rooms with Labour ministers, with Conservative ministers, with Liberal Democrat ministers. I sat in a room with a Minister for Social Care who had developed his MP's life championing older people till he became a Minister of Social Care, and they all give me the same line. It's complicated. We've got to be careful. We don't want there to be consequences that we didn't think of. We can do it for domestic abuse. We can do it for hate crime. We can do it for children. We can even do it for our animals. But when I talk to them about our old people, it's complicated. Where's the complication? You know, I watch them struggle about how do we define who it is that should be on the receiving end of adult protection. And in my naivety, folks, I'm sitting there thinking, well, isn't it somebody who's being abused and can't protect themselves? What else do I have to say? Isn't that it? I don't want to particularly know anything else. I just want to know that somebody is got a learning disability, a mental health problem, physical disability, is old and cannot protect themselves from somebody who's hurting or stealing from them. Isn't that enough? And yet we spent months having debates about what do we mean by vulnerable adult? And then we decided we won't have a definition of vulnerable adult at all because it was too complicated. But only that, we won't even have a definition of abuse. Our legal definition, our law, says abuse includes financial abuse. That's our only legal definition of abuse. Why? Why? How do we prosecute when that's all we've got? And why do we do this to ourselves? Why do we do it to ourselves? Because like I said to you, we all want to get old. Interesting point for you. We all want to get old. We don't want to be old. Think about that. It says an awful lot about our psychology. We want to get old. Nobody wants to die young. But we don't want to be old. What have we done to age? What have we done to age? Now, our view is this has to stop. This system is broken, and all that's happening is we're tinkering with it. I can somewhat cynically say to people living in England, if you're worried about your mum, move to Scotland, because at least you've got the Adult Support and Protection Act. We've got nothing in England. We're sending the wrong message to abusers. We're sending the wrong message to victims. We are not deterring. We need a different approach. This is why we're going for an aggravated offence of elder abuse. We're mirroring what we've done with hate crime, where it's an aggravated offence. And the aggravation is quite simple: the frailty and the vulnerability of the age of the victim. I like the 65 plus. It doesn't mean to say everybody's a victim. But it doesn't mean to say that we're putting it where it should be. And we want mandatory reporting. If I'm working as a nurse or I'm working as a care worker and I see abuse and I don't do something about it and I don't report it, shouldn't there be a consequence for me? Shouldn't we turn it on its head and say, if you step forward as a whistleblower, we'll support you, but the onus is on you to step forward? Shouldn't we say you're required to step forward, and if you don't, we'll do something about it? Won't it be easier to whistleblow in that context? We need mandatory reporting. What are the arguments against this? Firstly, the age-old argument, most older people don't want prosecutions. That's not true. Some older people don't want prosecutions, but that's as much not true with elder abuse as it is with domestic abuse. There are reasons why people don't want prosecution. You deal with those reasons. You don't take away the prosecution. Next one, we've got sufficient laws. We just need to make them work more effectively. Sir Oliver Heald, in response to our report, said exactly that. And what did he do? He deflected away from what we were saying, straight on to the new crimes of ill treatment and willful neglect, and straight on to the fact that prosecutions are the responsibility of the CPS. Did he address the issue he was saying, which is, it ain't working? Of course he didn't, because that's what governments do not do. They don't actually address what you say, they address what they want you to have said and then deal with that. It ignores the reality that most abuse is perpetrated by family members, and it ignores the reality of frailty and vulnerability, which has been recognised in hate and crime situations. If we can recognise it in some situations, why can't we recognise it in others? I've even heard the argument that by somehow introducing legislation to protect, it belittles old people. Well, I don't hear anybody arguing that domestic abuse laws belittle women when they're in a domestic abuse situation, or hate crime belittles people who are being abused because of their race or their religion. So why does we suddenly argue that this is different from old people? The fact is, it is against political realities. I accept the political realities right now say, don't knock on our door, look the other way, because we don't want to deal with this. We're going to change that. This may take time, and we're not expecting to do this overnight. There may well be resistance, but we're going to be there every single time we can make this point. And we're grabbing from the media as they come up with their suspended sentences and their community services, and we're pushing it back out to national so people can start to see just how often this is actually happening. We've always said that we're a bad penny, and we are a bad penny. We keep cropping up where the government don't want us to be. We like to pretend that they're going to believe we're a critical friend because they say we like critical friends, but actually they don't like critical friends. They'd rather like critical friends that actually don't speak. But we will speak out. We've been at this for a long time. This is a long haul for us, and we can stand the pace of this. We are going to win this. My hope is that organisations representing learning disabilities and mental health come along with us, and we develop this law into something that protects more than just older people. That's my hope, but it's not going to stop us. We cannot continue to see pictures like that of grade 4 pressure ulcers and nothing done about them. And I see them too often. It's got to stop. It's time for it to stop. Join with us. We've got our campaign. We've got our petition. Sign the petition. We'll send the stuff out to you. Give us the support. Let us defend the people. And I'll leave you with this picture, because this is it for us. Right now, we've got thousands of older people right this minute being abused. We can't see them. We can't reach them. There's a silent scream from people because they've got no way of voicing it. It's our job to make that silent scream heard as loudly as we possibly can. And the day we do that, I defy any minister to say, it's too complicated. Thank you for listening to me.